Please help me. They're hurting my grandma. The little girl, no more than 8 years old, came running between the parked cars, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face, heading straight for the group of men working outside the small garage. The morning had started like any other at the modest repair shop on Elm Street. Coffee was brewing in the office, classic rock played softly from an old radio, and the 4 men were already deep into their work. They'd been up since dawn, determined to prove that their small business could succeed despite the whispers and sideways glances from neighbors who couldn't forget their past. Carlos stopped wiping grease from his hands and looked at his partners. At 34, he'd been out of the penitentiary for only 6 months and never imagined that a simple day of honest work would turn into a situation that would test everything he'd learned about second chances. His dark eyes, weathered by years of hard choices and harder consequences, immediately focused on the child with the intensity of someone who'd seen too much suffering. "Easy there, sweetheart," he said gently, crouching down to the child's level. "What's happening?" "3 men broke into my grandma's house," the girl sobbed, pointing toward a modest home across the street. "They said she owes them a lot of money and they're breaking everything. They have sticks and they're so mean." Miguel, Roberto, and John emerged from under the hoods of cars they'd been working on, their faces immediately shifting from curiosity to concern. Miguel, at 41, was the oldest of the group, a former gang member who'd found peace in prison through a chaplain's guidance. Roberto, 29, had served time for armed robbery but discovered a talent for mechanics during his rehabilitation program. John, 33, had been the group's unofficial strategist during their incarceration, his quick mind helping them navigate prison politics and now legitimate business challenges. All ex-inmates, they'd met in Millfield State Penitentiary and decided to rebuild their lives together after serving their sentences. The neighborhood community still viewed them with suspicion. Whispers and sideways looks were constant, despite their consistent efforts to prove they'd changed. Parents pulled their children closer when they walked by, store owners watched them carefully, and police patrols seemed to increase whenever they were visible. "Where are your parents, honey?" Miguel asked, the oldest of the group, trying to assess the situation while wiping motor oil from his hands with a red rag. "My dad died when I was little, and my mom works at the hospital downtown. She won't be home until tonight," the girl cried, her small voice breaking with fear. "It's just me and Grandma Clara during the day. She's always been good to everyone, fed the stray dogs, helped anyone who needed it. She gives me cookies and reads me stories." The sound of breaking glass echoed from the house across the street, followed by muffled screams from an elderly woman and rough male voices shouting demands. The situation was escalating rapidly, and the little girl's terror was becoming more intense with each crash. Carlos looked at his friends, knowing exactly the dilemma they faced. Any involvement from them in a situation like this would automatically be interpreted negatively by neighbors and police. Ex-convicts near a violent incident? The conclusion would be obvious to everyone. Their parole officers had warned them repeatedly, "Stay out of trouble, don't get involved in other people's problems, and focus only on rebuilding your own lives." "If we do something, they'll blame us," Roberto muttered under his breath, glancing nervously at the growing number of neighbors peering through their windows. "You know what they think of us already." "And if we do nothing?" Carlos replied, watching the house where the screams were intensifying and seeing the absolute terror in the child's eyes. The girl tugged at Carlos's grease-stained work shirt with small, trembling hands. "You're the only grown-up men close by. Please, my grandma is all I have in the world. She takes care of me, makes sure I eat, helps me with homework. If something happens to her, I don't know what I'll do." It was at that moment something shifted in Carlos's eyes. During his 8 years in prison, he'd promised himself that if he ever had the chance to be different from what people expected, he wouldn't waste that opportunity. He'd seen too many men leave prison only to return because they'd never learned the difference between being feared and being respected. Standing there, faced with a defenseless child's desperate pleas, Carlos remained firm like someone who had finally found the exact moment to prove that some people can truly change, even when the whole world is waiting to judge them for their past. But what none of them knew was that this decision would trigger a chain of events that would forever change how their entire community viewed redemption and second chances. If you're enjoying this story of courage and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to see how a moment of choice became a powerful lesson about human nature. "We can't just stand here," Carlos said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much violence in his life. The sound of another crash from across the street made the decision for him. "John, call 911. Miguel, you and Roberto come with me." As they crossed the street, Mrs. Peterson from the corner house stepped onto her porch, her face twisted with suspicion. "What are those criminals doing now?" she called to her neighbor, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably working with whoever's in there." The words hit Carlos like a physical blow, but he kept walking. Through the broken front window, they could see 3 men in expensive suits ransacking the small living room. One of them, a tall man with gold teeth, was screaming at an elderly woman cowering in the corner. "Where's the rest of it, old lady? We know your dead son owed us 50 grand, not just the 20 we found." Grandma Clara, probably in her 70s, was trying to shield herself with a wooden chair. "I gave you everything I had. That was my entire savings." Carlos recognized the type immediately: loan sharks, the kind who preyed on desperate families and never let debts die, even when the debtor was already in the grave. He'd encountered plenty of them during his darker years, before prison taught him there were other ways to live. "Look, we can't go in there," Roberto whispered urgently. "You know what happens if the cops show up and find us inside? We'll be back in orange jumpsuits by nightfall." But Carlos was remembering something else: his own mother, alone and vulnerable after his father's death, being harassed by collectors who wouldn't accept that a dead man couldn't pay. He'd been too young and stupid then to help her the right way. Instead, he'd chosen violence, which led to 8 years behind bars and his mother dying alone while he was locked up. The gold-toothed man grabbed Clara by the arm, his voice turning menacing. "Maybe we need to send a message to other families about what happens when debts don't get paid." That's when Carlos saw it, a baseball bat in the man's other hand, and the way Clara's granddaughter was watching through the broken window, her small hands pressed against the glass in absolute terror. "I'm going in," Carlos said quietly. "You don't have to come with me, but I'm not walking away from this." Miguel grabbed his arm. "Carlos, think about what you're saying. We've worked too hard to rebuild our lives. One mistake and we lose everything." But as Carlos looked at the little girl's terrified face, then back at his friends who become his brothers through shared struggle and redemption, he realized something profound. What good was a second chance if you didn't use it to become the person you should have been all along? The question wasn't whether they could afford to get involved. It was whether they could afford not to, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't risking your future, but discovering you never really changed at all. "Wait," Miguel said, grabbing Carlos's shoulder as the sound of sirens grew closer. "If we're doing this, we do it smart, not stupid like before. We can't afford to go back to our old ways." John emerged from behind their garage, holding his phone and breathing heavily. "Cops are 5 minutes out, but I heard something else on the scanner. These aren't just loan sharks. They're connected to the Torino family. This is organized crime, Carlos. Vincent Torino himself might be in there." The name sent a chill through all of them. During their time in Millfield, they'd heard stories about Vincent Torino's crew. They didn't just collect debts, they made brutal examples that kept entire neighborhoods silent. 3 families had disappeared in the past 2 years after crossing Vincent's organization. The FBI had been hunting him for over a decade, but witnesses kept vanishing and evidence always seemed to disappear. But as Carlos watched through the broken window, seeing the gold-toothed man raise the baseball bat toward Clara's trembling form, something clicked in his mind. During his years in Millfield Penitentiary, he'd shared cell block D7 with Tommy the Wire Rodriguez, a former electronics expert who'd been serving 15 years for cyber fraud. Tommy had taught him things that weren't in any prison rehabilitation program: how criminals communicated, how they coordinated operations, and most importantly, how their overconfidence could be turned against them. "Roberto, you still have that old radio equipment in your truck?" Carlos asked quietly, his mind already formulating a plan that combined street intelligence with hard-earned prison wisdom. "Yeah, the CB radio and scanner setup, but why would we need?" Roberto started, then stopped as understanding dawned in his eyes. "Because Tommy taught me that guys like Vincent always use the same communication patterns. Same frequencies, same protocols, every time. 460.550 MHz for coordination, 462.725 for lookouts," Carlos explained, his voice taking on the strategic tone that had made him a respected figure even among hardened inmates. "We can't fight them with violence. That would make us exactly what everyone expects us to be. But we can use their own arrogance against them." Inside the house, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The gold-toothed man, who'd introduced himself as Mr. Vincent to Clara with mock formality, was getting increasingly frustrated as his methodical search of the modest home yielded nothing beyond Clara's meager savings. His two associates, both wearing expensive suits that looked out of place in the simple neighborhood, were systematically destroying furniture and belongings with the casual cruelty of men who'd done this many times before. "Search every room again, and I mean everything," Vincent barked, his New York accent thick with irritation. "Tear up the floorboards if you have to. The old witch is lying about the money. Danny Rodriguez told us he had insurance, investments, something worth 50 grand hidden somewhere." What Vincent didn't know, and what would ultimately lead to his downfall, was that Clara's late son Danny had been much smarter than any of them realized. Before his suspicious overdose 6 months earlier, Danny had been gathering evidence against Vincent's entire operation, not just as insurance, but because he'd planned to turn state's evidence and enter witness protection with his family. The detailed records, photographs, recorded conversations, and financial documents were hidden in safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank, and the key was sewn into Clara's favorite quilt, the same quilt she was clutching as Vincent terrorized her. Miguel quickly positioned himself at Roberto's truck, adjusting the radio equipment with the precision of someone who'd learned electronics repair during his own rehabilitation program. Carlos and Roberto moved toward the back of the house, using hand signals they developed during their prison years when communication needed to be silent and efficient. The police sirens were getting closer, but not close enough. Through the broken front window, they could see Vincent's patience running out as his systematic intimidation tactics failed to produce the results he expected. His face was flushed with anger, and his movements were becoming more erratic and dangerous. "You know what, Grandma? Maybe we need to wait for your little granddaughter to come home from school," Vincent said with calculated menace, checking his expensive Rolex. "Kids are much more cooperative than stubborn old ladies. And they have such delicate fingers, perfect for teaching lessons about family loyalty." Clara's face went white with terror. "She's only 8 years old. She doesn't know anything about Danny's business." "Exactly. Much easier to motivate someone when they don't understand why they're being hurt," Vincent replied with the cold detachment of a man who'd crossed moral lines so many times he could no longer see them. That's when Carlos realized this wasn't just about collecting a debt anymore. It was about eliminating witnesses and sending a message to anyone else who might consider crossing the Torino family. Vincent had no intention of leaving Clara or Hannah alive, regardless of whether he found the money. This was an execution disguised as a collection visit. His hands moved to the back door, testing the old lock quietly. 8 years in Millfield had taught him that sometimes the best way to help someone wasn't to charge in like a hero and risk making everything worse, but to be smart enough to turn the predator's own weapons and tactics against them. Violence would only prove the neighborhood's worst assumptions about ex-convicts, but strategy and intelligence could save lives while preserving everything they'd worked to rebuild. Roberto whispered into his earpiece, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Carlos, Miguel's intercepted their frequency. They've got a lookout posted 2 blocks north on Maple Street, and another crew coming as backup from their warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. We're not just facing 3 men, we're walking into a coordinated operation with at least 8 participants." John appeared at Carlos's shoulder, having circled around from the front. "I saw the lookout's vehicle, black Escalade with tinted windows. The backup team will be here in less than 10 minutes if we don't disrupt their communications." But as Carlos heard little Hannah's grandmother whimper in fear, and saw Miguel's determined face through the window reflection adjusting radio frequencies, he realized something that would change everything about their approach. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about ex-convicts isn't their criminal past or capacity for violence. It's how much they've learned about justice, strategy, and using the system's own rules while everyone assumed they were just learning to be better criminals. The police were 3 minutes away, but Carlos had a feeling that what happened in the next 180 seconds would determine whether a little girl grew up safely with her grandmother, or spent the rest of her life wondering why no one had been brave enough to help when it mattered most. More importantly, it would determine whether 4 ex-convicts proved that redemption was real, or confirmed every prejudice their community held about people like them. Vincent's walkie-talkie crackled to life, and Miguel's voice, perfectly disguised as the lookout's nervous tone, came through clear and urgent. "Mr. Vincent, we've got problems out here." "Miguel now," Carlos whispered as Vincent raised the bat toward Clara's head. Suddenly, Vincent's walkie-talkie crackled with Miguel's voice, perfectly imitating the lookout's tone. "Boss, cops everywhere. They got Tony and Marco. Get out now." Vincent's head snapped toward his radio. "What? How did?" But Carlos was already moving through the back door, his years of hard-earned street smarts guiding every step. While Vincent's crew panicked about the fake police raid, Carlos slipped behind the couch where Clara was hiding. "Mrs. Clara, it's okay. We're here to help," he whispered. "Where did Danny hide the evidence?" Clara's eyes widened in shock. "How did you know about?" "Because men like Vincent always leave loose ends, and smart kids like Danny always keep insurance," Carlos said, helping her to her feet. "The quilt, right? The key's in the quilt." Meanwhile, Vincent was screaming into his radio, "Where's the backup? I thought you said we had 20 minutes. Roberto's voice came through the device, disguised as dispatch, "All units compromised. Vincent Torino, you have federal warrants. Surrender immediately." The color drained from Vincent's face. "Federal? How do they know my—" That's when Carlos stepped into the living room, holding a small metal key and a smartphone with a video recording already running. "Because Danny Rodriguez was smarter than all of you combined." Vincent spun around, baseball bat still in hand. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who knows exactly what you are," Carlos said calmly. "See, Danny didn't just owe you money, he was gathering evidence. Photos of your drug operations, recorded conversations, financial records. Everything's in safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank." Vincent's two associates started backing toward the door, but Miguel and Roberto had already positioned themselves outside. The gold-toothed man's arrogance was cracking like ice under pressure. "You're bluffing. Some ex-con garage worker doesn't know." Vincent Michael Torino, born March 15, 1978. 3 arrests, no convictions because witnesses keep disappearing, Carlos interrupted, reading from his phone. "But Danny recorded everything, including your confession about the Morrison family murder in 2019. Vincent's face went white. The Morrison case had been cold for years, but if there was evidence— "The FBI's already been contacted," Carlos continued, showing his phone screen. "Funny thing about being ex-cons, we know exactly who to call when we find evidence of real crimes." The sound of actual police sirens was getting closer now, and Vincent realized his radio had gone silent. His backup wasn't coming because Miguel had jammed their frequency and sent them false retreat orders. His lookouts had fled thinking federal agents were closing in. "You have no idea what you've done," Vincent snarled, raising the bat. "Actually, I do," Carlos said, stepping protectively in front of Clara. "I'm giving a little girl her grandmother back, and sending you somewhere you can't hurt any more families." As police cars surrounded the house, Vincent dropped the bat and saw his entire operation crumbling around him. These weren't just some random ex-convicts, they were men who'd learned to use their hard-earned knowledge of the criminal world to protect instead of exploit. The most dangerous thing about ex-prisoners wasn't their past, it was how they could turn everything they'd learned in the darkness toward the light, and Vincent Torino was about to discover that some debts can only be paid with justice. 3 months later, Carlos stood outside Second Chance Auto Repair, watching Hannah help her grandmother Clara tend to the small flower garden they'd planted in front of the shop. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly painted storefront, where a new sign read Second Chance Auto Repair, honest work, honest people. The transformation had been more profound than anyone could have imagined. The FBI investigation into Vincent Torino's operation had uncovered a criminal network spanning 4 states, drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and 3 unsolved murders dating back 5 years. Vincent himself was now serving life without parole at ADX Florence, the same supermax prison where the most dangerous criminals in America spent their days in isolation. His entire organization had crumbled like a house of cards once Danny's evidence came to light. "Thank you again for everything," Clara said, approaching Carlos with a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies, the same recipe she'd been making for Hannah since the girl was 3 years old. The insurance money from Danny's policy finally came through once the truth about his death came out. He didn't overdose like they claimed. They murdered him when he threatened to expose their entire operation. Carlos nodded solemnly, accepting the warm cookies. The safety deposit box had contained not just evidence, but Danny's detailed confession that he'd been desperately trying to escape Vincent's organization and protect his family. His death hadn't been an accident or an overdose, it had been a calculated execution disguised as a drug-related fatality. The coroner had been paid off, the police report falsified, and a grieving family left to believe their son had chosen drugs over life. Mrs. Peterson, the same neighbor who'd called them criminals and troublemakers just months earlier, walked over with her husband carrying a fresh apple pie. "Carlos, Miguel, Roberto, John, we wanted to apologize for judging you boys so wrong. The whole neighborhood knows what really happened that day, and we're ashamed of how we treated you. We're recommending your shop to everyone we know," her husband added earnestly. "Honest work from honest men, that's becoming rare these days. You've got integrity, and that means everything to us now." The transformation had been remarkable and swift. Second Chance Auto Repair now had a 3-week waiting list, with customers driving from 3 counties away specifically to support the heroes who took down the Torino crime family. Local businesses started actively hiring ex-convicts, inspired by what they'd witnessed. The mayor had even proposed a citywide Second Chance employment initiative, using their shop as the model program. Miguel had enrolled in community college to study advanced electronics and computer systems, using skills that Tommy the Wire Rodriguez had taught Carlos during their shared cell years, knowledge that Carlos had passed on to his brothers. Roberto was now coaching Little League Baseball 3 evenings a week, teaching kids that discipline and teamwork could accomplish more than anger and violence ever could. John had started a mentorship program for troubled teenagers, visiting local high schools to share his story of transformation and second chances. Detective Sarah Martinez, who'd handled Vincent's arrest and had initially been skeptical of ex-convicts taking the law into their own hands, now stopped by weekly for coffee and updates. "You know, in 20 years on the force, I've never seen anything like what you four accomplished," she said, sitting on the shop's front porch. "Ex-cons taking down organized crime with intelligence and strategy instead of violence and revenge. You've completely changed how our entire department thinks about rehabilitation and community partnerships." The ripple effects had spread far beyond their neighborhood. The state prison system invited them to speak at rehabilitation programs. A documentary crew had filmed their story for a Netflix series about successful reintegration. 3 other cities had reached out to learn about replicating their model of ex-convict entrepreneurship and community involvement. Hannah ran up to Carlos, holding a new crayon drawing, this one showing 4 men in work uniforms standing in front of a garage, with a little girl and an elderly woman smiling nearby, surrounded by other neighborhood families all holding hands. "This is all of us now," she announced proudly, her gap-toothed smile brighter than the morning sun. "Grandma Clara says you're not just our guardian angels, you're the whole neighborhood's guardian angels." Carlos knelt down to Hannah's level, his weathered hands gentle as he examined her artwork. His voice was soft but carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "No, sweetheart. We're just people who learned that everyone deserves a second chance, including ourselves. But more importantly, we learned that second chances are only valuable if you use them to help other people get their first real chance at safety and happiness." Clara wrapped her arm around her granddaughter, tears glistening in her eyes. "Danny would be so proud," she whispered. "His sacrifice wasn't meaningless after all. His evidence didn't just put bad men in prison, it showed good men how to be heroes." As the sun set behind the shop, Carlos looked at his partners, Miguel organizing tools with methodical precision, Roberto teaching a neighbor kid how to check tire pressure, John updating their appointment book with steady, careful handwriting. These men who become his brothers through shared struggle, shared redemption, and shared purpose had discovered something that no prison counselor or parole officer had ever been able to teach them. They'd learned that the best revenge against a society that expected them to fail was simply refusing to fail, and using everything they'd learned in darkness to bring light to others. Vincent Torino had tried to destroy an innocent family, but instead destroyed himself by underestimating 4 men who'd learned that true strength isn't about intimidation, manipulation, or violence. It's about standing up when standing up matters most, even when the cost might be everything you've worked to rebuild. Carlos tucked Hannah's drawing into his work shirt pocket, right next to the first drawing she'd given him 3 months ago. "This is going with me wherever I go," he said softly, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd finally found his purpose. The greatest justice isn't punishing those who've made mistakes, but giving them the chance to prove that people can change, grow, and become the heroes their communities desperately need them to be. And sometimes, the most broken people become the strongest protectors because they understand exactly what it feels like to need saving. If this story of second chances, transformation, and the power of choosing courage over fear touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others who believe in redemption, because sometimes the people society has given up on are exactly the ones who refuse to give up on society.